The wind had already begun to change. It started as a whisper, a faint chill that slid down the valley and curled around the small wooden huts scattered along the edge of the forest. The peasants, though poor and burdened, had lived long enough to understand these quiet signals. A sharper bite in the evening breeze, the crunch of frost forming at dawn, and the way the birds moved away in restless flocks, all of these were reminders that winter was close, and it would not be merciful. For the medieval peasant, winter was never simply a season. It was a trial, a long test of endurance, where the balance between survival and starvation hung by the thinnest of threads. To the nobleman in his stone manor, winter might have meant feasts in the great hall, fires roaring in every chamber, and blankets of furs piled high on feather beds. But for the villager, who tilled the Lord's land in spring and summer, and gathered whatever scraps of harvest could be spared, the cold months meant scarcity, hunger, and the constant effort to keep death at bay. The huts of the peasants were humble structures, often built from wattle and dobsticks interwoven and plastered with mud, dung, and straw. The roofs were thatched, thick enough to keep out the rain but not always strong enough to withstand the heavy snow that winter clouds threatened to release. Smoke drifted from the holes in their roofs. 4 chimneys were rare luxuries, and the air inside was forever thick with the scent of wood smoke, boiled cabbage, and damp wool at the first frost. Every villager moved with a purpose, sharpened by generations of experience. They knew that what they did in these fleeting days of autumn would decide the comfort or the misery of the months ahead. Men chopped and gathered wood, stacking it in careful piles, though it was never enough. Women salted meat if they had it, or dried peas, beans, and turnips for the lean times. Children were sent to gather kindling, small branches, and even animal dung to dry and later burn. When the sun sank early, and the shadows stretched long across the fields, the villagers would glance toward the horizon, where clouds swirled in heavy grays and purples. They knew the first snow was coming, and once it arrived, the world would be locked in silence. Roads impassable, fields buried, and the daily battle of survival fully begun. But in these first nights of the approaching winter, there was still movement, still the rhythm of preparation. The peasants patched holes in their clothing, stitching wool onto old linen, weaving rough cloaks, and wrapping their feet in layers of cloth. 4 leather shoes were too costly for many. The animals, sheep, pigs, and the occasional cow, were herded into crude shelters, barns that leaked wind through their wooden slats, but provided at least a little warmth. In the evenings, families huddled together on straw-stuffed mattresses, spread across the dirt floor. The fire crackled, a comfort against the howling wind outside. Shadows flickered on the walls as mothers whispered to their children warnings of hunger. But also stories, old tales passed down from one frozen season to the next. For every family in the village, winter was both feared and expected. They knew what it could take, and they knew it was only by unity, endurance, and stubborn will that they would see the thaw again. And so, the first chapter of survival began not in the heart of the coldest nights, but in the calm before them, when the land itself seemed to draw a long, icy breath, preparing to blanket everything beneath. Snow and silence. Life in a medieval village was simple, but it was never easy. The people who lived there did not own the land they worked. The fields, meadows, and forests belonged to the lord in the manor house, and the peasants, bound to the soil, labored on his behalf. In return, they were allowed a patch of earth for their families and the protection of the manor's walls when raiders or wild beasts threatened. Yet in winter, that protection could not keep away the cold, nor could it fill empty stomachs. The village itself was a small cluster of huts and farm buildings, often arranged along a single muddy road that lead toward the Lord's manor or a nearby church. In summer, these paths were alive with the chatter of animals, carts, and barefoot children. But in winter, the mud froze hard, the ruts filled with ice, and only the sound of boots crunching snow or a cartwheel creaking slowly broke the silence. Inside, the hut's space was scarce. Families often lived in one room, sometimes with their animals sharing the warmth. The floor was packed earth, uneven and cold, and straw was scattered to make it softer underfoot. In the corner, a fire burned, not in a hearth with a chimney, but in a shallow pit, its smoke escaping through holes in the roof or gaps in the thatch. The air was always heavy with soot, and eyes stung as the flames flickered low. Meals were modest and repetitive. Bread, coarse and dark, was the staple. It was made from rye, barley, or oats, for wheat was costly and often reserved for the wealthy. Alongside bread came pottage, thick stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables could be spared from the garden. In summer and autumn, herbs and greens gave it flavor, but in the depths of winter, it might be little more than peas boiled in water with a pinch of salt, if salt could be afforded at all. Meat was rare, reserved for feast days or special occasions, though salted pork, dried fish, or a rabbit caught in the woods might sometimes appear in the pot. Children learned early to help. Even the youngest gathered twigs, fetched water from the well, or helped feed the animals. By the time they were 10 or 12, they worked in the fields alongside their parents, their small hands as red and raw from the cold as any adults. Their laughter still rang through the frosty mornings, but their games were simple and often involved little more than tossing stones, running in the snow, or pretending to be the hunters and warriors they heard about in tales. Though poor, the villagers were not without a sense of community. Winter forced them closer together. They shared tools, exchanged food when one family's stores ran thin, and looked after one another's children. The village priest reminded them often that charity was a Christian duty, and while generosity was sometimes scarce, survival depended on cooperation. The cold shaped every aspect of daily life. Water froze in buckets, so women kept pots near the fire to melt snow. Clothing was patched and layered tunics worn until the fabric thinned, cloaks repaired with rough stitching, hoods pulled low against the wind. Gloves were rare, but hands were wrapped in strips of cloth or hidden inside sleeves. Even at night, families slept fully dressed, pulling woolen blankets or animal skins over themselves, their bodies pressed close together for warmth. When the days grew shorter, life slowed. The fields lay empty, buried in frost. So much of the peasants' labor shifted indoors. Men carved wooden tools, repaired carts, and mended fences when the weather allowed. Women spun wool, wove cloth, or brewed ale in small batches, a weak drink that nourished better than cold water. And when there was little work to do, they simply sat by the fire, silent, listening to the wind as it rattled the shutters. The church was the heart of the village, even in winter. On Sundays, the people gathered there, trudging through the snow, in heavy boots or wrapped cloaks. The priest spoke of patience, endurance, and faith in God's mercy. The warmth of belief offered comfort when the cold seemed endless, and the promise of spring became a kind of prayer whispered in every household. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm of daily life, fear lingered. Winter brought hunger, sickness, and sometimes death. Fever spread easily in cramped huts, and children were often the first to weaken. When food ran low, parents gave the best portions to their little ones, even if it meant going hungry themselves. And when the snow piled high against the doors, cutting off paths to the forest or the manor, families learned to endure on whatever scraps they had managed to keep. Still, life in the village moved on. The people had known hardship for generations, and hardship taught them resilience. They laughed when they could, prayed when they must, and held tightly to one another, knowing that the only way to see the thaw was to survive the freeze together. The peasants knew that once the snows fell heavy and the earth turned hard as stone, preparation would mean the difference between endurance and suffering. Winter did not forgive carelessness. Every task, no matter how small, was done with a quiet urgency, for the memory of past cold seasons lingered in their minds. The first task was food. In the weeks before the deep freeze, families stored away what little they had. Grains were kept in wooden chests or clay jars, sealed with wax or cloth to protect against moisture and mice. Turnips, onions, and cabbages were piled in root cellars. Pits dug into the earth, lined with straw, and covered with planks. There, in the damp darkness, vegetables could last through the long months, though some would rot before spring returned. Dried beans and peas were precious, for they filled the pot with thick pottage that could stretch to feed many mouths. If a family had salt, they preserved pork or fish, hanging the slabs from wooden beams where smoke and dryness could keep them edible. But salt was costly, and not every household could spare enough coin for such luxury. More often, meat was eaten fresh in autumn, and rarely seen again until the feast of Christmas, if at all. Firewood was next. The men ventured into the forest, their boots crunching frost as they hauled axes and rope. They felled small trees, trimmed branches, and dragged the logs back to the village. The wood was chopped and stacked in neat piles against the walls of huts, covered with thatch or bark to keep the snow from soaking in. Yet even with their efforts, the piles always looked smaller than they wished. Winter fires devoured wood quickly, and the peasants learned to burn sparingly, banking coals under ash at night so the fire could be stirred to life again in the morning. Women and children joined in the work by gathering kindling fallen twigs, dry grass, and even dung from the animals, shaped into small cakes and left to harden. These made the difference between a fire that struggled and a fire that caught quickly on a bitter morning. Children often carried baskets twice their size, their little hands red from the cold, but they understood the importance of their task. Clothing, too, had to be made ready. Wool was spun and woven into rough cloth, patched onto tunics, cloaks, and hoods. Old garments were mended until they were more stitched than fabric. Mittens and caps were fashioned where wool could be spared, though many simply wrapped their hands and feet in strips of cloth. Fur, when available, was highly prized, sewn into cloaks or used as lining in boots. Families who owned sheep sheared them in spring, and by autumn, the wool had been spun into thick, coarse garments that might just withstand the frost. The huts themselves needed attention. Cracks in the daub were sealed with fresh mud and straw. Thatched roofs were patched where rain or snow might seep through. Wooden shutters were repaired to keep out the wind, though gaps always remained. Straw was laid thick across the floors, replaced whenever it grew damp, to insulate the families against the chill rising from the frozen ground. Attention turned also to the animals, for they were as vital to survival as the people themselves. Pigs, chickens, goats, and cows were herded into crude barns, their breath steaming in the cold air. These barns were not warm, but they shielded the beasts from snow and biting winds. Families carried hay and grain into the stalls, careful not to overfeed, for supplies had to last the whole season. Sometimes, when fodder ran low, animals were slaughtered early, their meat salted or smoked, their hides turned into clothing or bedding. It was a painful choice, for fewer animals meant fewer chances of survival in the spring. But hunger forced such decisions. As the village worked, there was an air of quiet determination. No one expected comfort. They expected hardship, but they did not face it passively. Preparation was their defense, their way of pushing back against the inevitability of winter's cruelty. Each task completed, each storehouse filled, brought a small measure of reassurance when the first snows finally fell. Blanketing the roofs and fields in white, the peasants retreated into their huts, drawing close to the fires they had so carefully prepared for. The world outside grew silent, muffled by snowdrifts, but inside there was the faint crackle of burning wood, the smell of simmering pottage, and the warmth of bodies huddled together, and though they knew the hardest weeks still lay ahead, they could rest a little easier, for they had done all they could. Their survival now depended on endurance, patience, and faith that their preparations would carry them through the long, frozen nights. When winter settled fully upon the land, the nights seemed to stretch without end. The sun sank early, sometimes disappearing before the peasants had finished their evening chores, and the darkness crept in like a tide. The villagers marked time by the fire's glow, by the fading of embers, by the stars that glittered faintly through gaps in the thatch roofs. Days were short, but the nights long, heavy, and filled with silence, were where the struggle of survival truly began. Inside the huts, families drew close together. The fire in the center of the room burned low, for wood had to be conserved. Shadows danced on the wattle and daub walls, and smoke lingered in the air, clinging to clothing, hair, and skin. The smell of damp straw mixed with the faint aroma of pottage, sometimes rich with beans, sometimes little more than thin broth. The long nights were endured rather than lived. Work in the fields was impossible, so time slowed to the pace of the fire's crackle and the sound of wind rattling the shutters. Yet, in that slowing, the peasants found rituals, ways of passing the hours that stretched endlessly before dawn. Children were the first to grow restless. Too small to bear silence, they begged for stories. And so, as the flames flickered, parents and grandparents told them tales. Some were of saints and miracles, reminders of faith and the hope of God's mercy. Others were old folk tales, whispered, for generations, of forest spirits, wandering souls, or beasts that prowled in the snow. These stories carried lessons as much as entertainment warnings about greed, pride, or laziness, told in voices hushed and steady, so that the children would remember. Sometimes, when the mood was light, a villager would hum a song. It might be a hymn learned from the church, or a simple tune passed down in the family. The melody filled the small room, soft and steady, rising above the howl of the wind outside. Children fell asleep to these sounds, their heads resting against their mothers, while fathers sat watchful, feeding the fire little by little to keep the chill at bay. Tasks, too, continued by the firelight. Women spun wool, their hands working, even in the dim glow. Men carved wooden handles, mended tools, or patched harnesses for the oxen. Even when the body ached for rest, idleness felt dangerous, for every bit of work might mean an easier tomorrow. A pair of mittens finished in January could keep a child's hands from frostbite in February. A repaired bucket might mean fewer trips to the frozen well. The nights were also times of prayer. The priest often reminded the villagers that endurance was a sign of faith. Families knelt together, whispering prayers for warmth, for food, for the safety of loved ones. Candles, precious and made from tallow, were lit sparingly, their faint flames casting halos of golden light across weary faces. The words of prayer carried them through the stillness, offering comfort when little else could be found. Yet fear lingered too. The long nights were when sickness crept in most cruelly. A child's cough echoing through the hut, a fever that would not break, or a sudden weakness in the elderly all, were signs that winter might claim another soul. There were no doctors, only herbs and whispered remedies passed down through generations. A poultice of garlic, a drink brewed from honey, and herbs, or the warmth of stones wrapped in clothies, were the medicines of the poor. Some healed, some did not, and in the night, when the wind howled loudest, families whispered prayers for mercy. Despite the hardship, there were moments of strange beauty in the long nights. When the fire had burned down to glowing embers, when the children were asleep, and silence filled the hut, peasants sometimes listened to the world outside. The muffled stillness of snow, the distant call of an owl, or the creak of ice forming on the river all reminded them that they were part of something vast, something both cruel and wondrous, and always the stars remained on the rare nights when the clouds broke and a villager stepped outside. The sky stretched wide, filled with countless lights. The cold air was sharp, but the heavens felt near, as if reminding the weary souls below that winter, however endless it seemed, was only one season among many. So the peasants endured the long nights as best they could with stories, songs, work, prayer, and silence. The darkness was not defeated, but it was endured, and in endurance they found a kind of strength, passed from parent to child, year after year, winter after winter. Winter was not only endured through preparation. When the cold deepened and the snow piled high, survival demanded constant ingenuity. The peasants were poor, but they were resourceful, and necessity sharpened their skills into habits that carried them through the season year after year. One of the most important tasks was keeping the fire alive. Fire was more than warmth, it was life itself. Without it, food could not be cooked, water could not be melted, and frost would creep swiftly into every corner of the hut. Peasants learned to bank the embers at night, covering them with ash, so that they smoldered until morning. At dawn, a small breath of air, a handful of dry twigs, and patience could coax the faint red glow back into flame. Families who let their fire die faced a desperate struggle, for kindling was scarce, and striking sparks from flint and steel was slow in frozen weather. Neighbors sometimes shared flame, carrying glowing coals carefully between huts and clay pots, as precious as gold. Food, always meager, was stretched with every trick they knew. The pottage pot hung perpetually over the fire, a bubbling mixture that changed little from day to day. Each morning, new scraps were added: beans, dried peas, a turnip, or if fortune allowed, a bit of pork fat. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled until they surrendered their last flavor, then cracked open so the marrow could be eaten. Stale bread was softened in broth. Even weeds that grew beneath the snow were gathered when discovered: nettles, sorrel, or chickweed, small greens that brightened the dull stew. Foraging did not end with the harvest. Children and women searched the edges of forests for nuts, hidden by squirrels, or berries left shriveled on the branches. Hazelnuts, chestnuts, or acorns, if carefully prepared, could fill hungry bellies. The forest also offered bark that could be boiled into a bitter tea, or roots dug carefully from frozen ground. Each discovery, however small, brought relief, for it meant one more meal that would last until spring. Hunting was rare, but not absent. Peasants had no right to hunt. The Lord's deer poaching was punished harshly, but hunger sometimes pushed them into the forests with snares and traps. Rabbits, hares, and birds were the most common catch, their meat roasted quickly over the fire or boiled into pottage. In harsher winters, villagers whispered of those who risked poaching larger game. The danger was great, but so was the hunger. A single deer could feed many mouths for many days, though discovery by the Lord's men could bring heavy fines, or worse. Fishing was another skill. Even in winter, streams sometimes flowed beneath sheets of ice. Men cut holes with axes, dropping simple lines baited with worms, or set woven baskets in the current to catch whatever swam near. The catch was small, often no more than a handful of perch or eels, but it added variety to the diet. Fish could also be smoked and dried, lasting weeks when carefully stored. Animal husbandry was another form of survival. Cows and goats gave milk when they could, though the yield was small in winter. What little milk was drawn was often turned to cheese, which kept longer and provided nourishment when fresh food was scarce. Chickens, if they survived the cold, laid fewer eggs, but even a single egg was a treasure in the bleakest months. Every creature mattered. A pig fattened through autumn could mean salted meat in the cellar. A sheep, alive, offered wool for clothing and warmth. Survival also depended on the body itself. Peasants learned to move often, to keep blood flowing in the bitter air. Chores were constant, and though exhausting, they brought warmth through labor. Water had to be carried, animals fed, and wood chopped, even when the cold numbed fingers and froze the ground beneath their boots. Rest was taken only when work was done, and always beside the fire. Perhaps the greatest skill was sharing. Though each family struggled for its own survival, the village understood that unity was strength. A neighbor might share fire when another's hearth grew cold. A mother might offer a spoonful of grain to feed a starving child, not her own. In return, she would one day receive kindness when her own stores ran low. This unspoken system of give and take, woven through years of hardship, was as essential as food or fire. Alone, a family might starve. Together, the village endured, and so, through clever hands, patient endurance, and a spirit of quiet cooperation, the peasants survived the harshest weeks. They did not thrive, nor did they expect to. But survival itself was victory, earned day by day, night by night. In a world where the cold seemed determined to claim everything, winter did not test only the body, it tested the spirit. When the nights grew longest and hunger gnawed hardest, peasants turned to the unseen, the comfort of faith, the weight of tradition, and the whispers of old stories passed down through generations. Survival was not only measured in bread and firewood, but in the strength of the mind and heart. The church stood at the center of village life, even in the harshest storms. Its stone walls and modest steeple rose above the thatched huts, a silent reminder that God was near. On Sundays and on holy days, villagers gathered despite the cold. They trudged through snow, cloaks wrapped tightly, boots heavy with ice, their breath clouding in the bitter air. Inside, the church was no warmer than their huts, but the air was filled with prayer, and that was warmth of a different kind. The priests spoke of patience, of trials, of the promise of eternal reward for those who endured suffering on earth. His words were familiar, yet they carried weight, especially in winter. God does not forget you, he would remind them, his voice echoing through the cold stone nave. Spring will come, as surely as the Lord rises after the night. The peasants nodded, their hearts lifted, if only for a moment. Religious festivals punctuated the long season. Advent and Christmas brought joy, even when food was scarce. Families saved what little they could, perhaps a bit of meat, a cup of ale, or a small loaf of wheat bread for the feast. Candlelight services filled the dark nights with song, and children stared wide-eyed at the crochet, the story of the Christ child told once more. For a night, hunger was forgotten, replaced by carols, prayers, and the faint sweetness of hope. Candlemas in February was another marker, when candles were blessed in the church to carry light into homes still dark from winter's grasp. Such rituals gave rhythm to time, reminding villagers that winter, though long, was not endless. But faith was not always confined to the church. Alongside the teachings of priests lived older beliefs, half-remembered customs rooted in the land itself. The peasants were practical, and where Christian ritual ended, folklore often began. The forest, for instance, was never just a forest. In the long nights, it was said to be alive with spirits. Children were warned not to wander too close, lest they meet the wandering souls of the unburied dead, or creatures that whispered promises in the wind. Some told of wolves, whose eyes glowed like embers, not of flesh and blood, but of shadow and hunger. Others whispered of fair folk, strange, hidden beings who could bless or curse, depending on the offering left at the edge of the woods. Charms and tokens were kept close. A sprig of holly above the door, thought to keep evil at bay. A carved cross on the barn, to protect the animals. Knots tied in string, worn on the wrist, to guard against fevers. The priest might frown at such practices, yet he did not always speak against them, for even he knew the power of belief when fear pressed. In the heart of winter, storytelling became both shield and comfort. Around the fire, Old men and women spoke of winters past, of the year the river froze so thick an ox cart could cross it, of the famine that claimed half the village, of the miracle when a traveler arrived with sacks of grain just in time. These stories were not told to frighten but to remind. Others had suffered and endured, and so could they. Folklore also carried lessons. A tale of a farmer who failed to share his food and was cursed with blight. A story of a woman who kept her fire burning through prayer and kindness, saving her children from the frost. A warning of a man who hunted on holy days and never returned. Swallowed by the snow? Through these stories, children learned patience, faith, and humility. Lessons stitched into the very fabric of their survival. Winter was cruel, but belief gave it meaning. Hunger was not just hunger. It was a test of endurance. Cold was not only cold, it was a reminder to trust in God's mercy. The long silence of the snow-covered land was not emptiness, but a season to reflect, to pray, to wait, and when the wind howled outside, rattling shutters and bending trees, peasants whispered prayers into the dark, not certain whether they were heard, but comforted by the act itself. Faith, folklore, ritual, and story all were threads woven together, binding hearts against despair. For in the deepest cold, what kept the peasants alive was not only bread in the pot or wood on the fire, but hope carried in prayer, in tale, in song, and in the quiet conviction that winter, no matter how harsh, would give way to spring. No winter lasted forever, though it often felt endless, though the cold pressed into bone and the nights stretched without mercy. There always came a day when something subtle shifted. The peasants, hardened by long seasons of frost, noticed it at once. The sun lingered a little longer on the horizon. The air, though still sharp, carried the faintest hint of softness. Snow on the rooftops began to drip in slow rivulets, and the frozen river groaned as ice cracked and loosened. The first signs of spring were not grand. They were small, quiet miracles, noticed only by those who had endured the months of silence. A bird's call, piercing the dawn. The green tip of a shoot pushing bravely through thawing earth. The scent of wet soil rising as the snow retreated. To the peasant, these were not mere changes in nature. They were promises that the long trial was nearly over. Food stores were thin by then, the grain chest nearly empty, the root cellar holding only shriveled vegetables, the pottage pot stretched thinner each day. But the people had survived. The weakest had sometimes been lost, as winter often demanded its price. Yet those who remained carried within them a quiet strength, born of endurance. As the days grew longer, work stirred once more. The fields, still damp and muddy, awaited the plow. Men repaired harnesses, sharpened tools, and readied the oxen. Women turned to the gardens, clearing away the remnants of frost, preparing the soil for beans, peas, and herbs. Children, freed from the suffocating grip of long nights indoors, ran laughing through the slush, chasing one another with the energy of creatures reborn. The animals, too, seemed to sense the change. Cows gave milk more freely, goats bleated eagerly for fresh pasture, and chickens scratched in the thawing earth, searching for worms. Each sign reminded the peasants that life had returned, cautious but steady. With spring came feast days of Thanksgiving. The church bells rang more brightly, echoing across the fields, calling the villagers to prayer. They knelt not only in devotion, but in gratitude for warmth, for light, for survival itself. The priest reminded them that winter's suffering was never in vain, that endurance was a virtue, and that hardship strengthened faith. The people, weary but hopeful, bowed their heads, knowing his words rang true. The first gatherings of spring were filled with cautious joy. A loaf of fresh bread baked from the last of the stored grain tasted sweeter than any feast. A single egg from a chicken was cause for celebration. Even a thin stew, made from the first tender greens of the season, seemed like a banquet after months of dried beans and stale roots. Yet the memory of winter lingered. It always did. The peasants knew it would return, as it always had, with cold winds and long nights. But for now, they let themselves breathe. They let themselves feel the sun on their faces, the soil beneath their hands, the rhythm of work that carried promise instead of fear. Children skipped along the muddy road, singing songs they had half forgotten during the long silence. Women hung washed clothes to dry in the breeze, marveling at how quickly they stiffened in the sun instead of the frost. Men stood at the edges of their fields, gazing across the land with eyes filled not only with duty, but with hope. Spring did not erase winter, but it redeemed it. Every hardship faced in the cold months made the warmth sweeter. Every story told in the dark made the songs brighter in the light. Every loss deepened the gratitude for every life spared, and so the cycle continued. The peasants knew that another winter would come, as surely as the sun would set. But they also knew that they had endured before, and they would endure again. For survival was not an accident. It was a skill, a faith, a strength passed down through generations. Forged in the frost, and awakened with the thaw in the end. What mattered most was not merely that they had survived, but how they had survived together, with patience, with resilience, and with hope that, even in the coldest winters, the promise of spring was always waiting, just beyond the snow.